Muy buenas noches. Después de este problemita técnico, aquí estamos alternándonos ser el anfitrión de esta transmisión. Entonces, en algún momento me quedé sin autorización. Quiero comentar justamente eso, ¿verdad? Para arrancar, vamos a tener cerrados los micrófonos de los participantes, ¿verdad? Pero va a estar abierto para plantear preguntas a través de el chat de esta transmisión, bueno, de este proceso por Zoom y a través de las redes sociales. Estamos acá en esta conferencia organizada por una cantidad importante de instituciones aquí en la Universidad de Costa Rica, la conferencia Ain't I a Woman? The Black Female Body Beyond Trauma, una conferencia a cargo de la doctora Myriam Moïse de la Universidad de las Antillas. La conferencia la ofrecerá en inglés, pero como fue comentado previamente, se tendrá la oportunidad de traducción simultánea. Es una actividad organizada por el proyecto ConnectCaribbean de la Unión Europea. Sobre esto nos conversará más adelante la doctora Karen Poe, con la participación de distintas instancias de la Universidad de Costa Rica, como es el Instituto de Investigaciones en Arte, el Programa de Posgrado en Arte, el Centro de Investigaciones Históricas de América Central, la Escuela de Psicología y el proyecto Encuentro Internacional de Psicología y Patologías del Capitalismo. Todas estas entidades en un esfuerzo interdisciplinario para aproximarnos a un tema de tal importancia como justamente las corporalidades. A continuación, la doctora Karen Poe nos va a hablar sobre el proyecto Connect Caribbean y cómo se entronca con esta actividad.
Sí, buenas noches a todos y a todas. Para mí es un verdadero placer y alegría estar aquí esta noche em, para escuchar la conferencia de Myriam. Como decía Bertol, esta conferencia forma parte de un gran proyecto cuyo título, digamos, completo es Connected Worlds, the Caribbean Origin of the Modern World, que ha sido financiado por el programa Marie Curie de la Unión Europea. Este, este proyecto, digamos que tiene como uno de sus grandes objetivos crear lazos entre universidades europeas y universidades del Caribe y de América Latina. Es dirigido por la doctora Consuelo Naranjo Orobio, quien está aquí presente desde Costa Rica. Hay 4 invitados del CSIC, institución a la que ella pertenece, el Instituto de Historia, y ella tiene a su cargo, digamos, la dirección de todo este gran proyecto. Están con ella Miguel Ángel Push Samper, Dolores González Ripoll y Leida Fernández, además de Myriam Moïse, que dará hoy la conferencia. Ellos están aquí en Costa Rica. En parte, también asociados a la inauguración de una muestra que está durante todo el mes de abril y de mayo en la Biblioteca Nacional, que se llama la esclavitud y el legado cultural de África en el Caribe. Los invito también a que la vayan a ver, ahí va a estar disponible durante todo este tiempo. Este gran proyecto, digamos, aúna además del CSIC, que ya mencioné, a la Universidad de Sevilla, a la Universidad Pablo Olavide, también en Sevilla, y a Ediciones 12 Calles en España, y a otras universidades europeas como la Universidad de las Antillas, el Polo Martinica, la Sorbonne Nouvelle París 3, la Leibniz Universitat de Hannover y la Universidad del Sacro Cuore en Milán. Además, formamos parte, la Universidad de Costa Rica con el CIHAC. De Colombia hay 2 universidades, la Universidad del Norte y la Universidad de Magdalena, el CECLA por la Universidad de Chile, la Academia de Historia de Cuba y la Pontificia Universidad Católica de República Dominicana y la Universidad Ana Méndez de Puerto Rico. Este proyecto está, digamos, comenzó en el 2019, pero debido a la pandemia hemos tenido que ampliar el paso hasta el 2024. Yo paso ahora entonces a presentar a Myriam. Ella es profesora asociada de estudios ingleses y de género en la Universidad de las Antillas, Martinica y Guadalupe. También es vicepresidenta de Relaciones Internacionales de esa misma universidad. Tiene un doctorado en estudios anglófonos en la Sorbona, en París, y otro doctorado en literaturas inglesas por la Universidad de West Indies. Sus campos de investigación son los estudios culturales, los estudios de género y el análisis de discursos enfocados en las creaciones literarias y artísticas de las mujeres caribeñas afrodescendientes. Ha sido investigadora visitante en New York University en el 2009, en Brown University en el 2012, en University College de London en el 2018 y es becaria Fulbright en Emory en el 2020. Su trabajo más reciente, su libro se titula Border Transgression and Reconfiguration of Caribbean Spaces. La doctora Moïse además es secretaria general del Consorcio de Universidades e Institutos de Investigación del Caribe y los dejo entonces con ella para disfrutar de su conferencia.
Okay, good. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me properly? See?
Sí.
I have no sound. Unless nobody is speaking, maybe.
Sí, sí, te oímos.
Sound is okay. I suggest I start. I just cannot hear anything, but I guess nobody is speaking at this moment. So I want to thank everyone for the organization, the University of Costa Rica in particular, the program coordinator, Professor Chelo Naranjo. I wonder if I don't think I'm connected anymore. Am I?
Yes, you are.
Yes, I am. I don't know, I'm confused.
Sí, mira. Can you hear Myriam? ¿Oís a Myriam?
Sí, Loles, la oímos perfectamente.
Okay. Pero que digan algo.
No,
es que
because I
nada.
have two. Oh yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Ah, okay.
I'm here. Okay, so right. Apologies for these technical glitches. I want to thank my colleagues and friends who are here to assist me and who represent my audience, my physical audience tonight. So in the context of my research, I would like to present my conference today entitled Hentai a Woman, the Black Female Body Beyond Trauma. I want to start with a quotation. Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And hire a woman? Black female abolitionist Sojourner Truth's question anti-woman in a well-known 1851 speech at the Ohio Women's Suffrage Convention emphasizes the need for the woman of African descent to assert a womanhood and empower herself through the reconstruction and liberation of her body and tongue. Sojourner Truth then urged her audience to look at her, to look at the very characteristics of her Black female body, a body marked by gender as well as race and class. In fact, as Australian feminist Elizabeth Gross points out in Volatile Bodies Toward a Corporeal Feminism, the body must be regarded as a site of social, political, cultural, and geographical inscriptions, production, or constitution. The body is not opposed to culture, a resistant throwback to a natural past. It is in itself the cultural product. My conference today seeks to explore representations of the Black female body as the very product of the tensions between women's lives and the cultural meanings which marked Black women's bodily experiences across the Americas. The Black female body, the female body of African descent, must indeed be analyzed within its very specificities, as it is a marked, historicized space of conflicts, a site of trauma and dehumanization through the processes of enslavement, colonialism, and neocolonialism. The bodies of enslaved African women have been cruelly exploited, sexually abused, chained, pried open, flayed, and discarded. And they were exposed to the same severe working conditions as their male counterparts that they often outnumbered as field hands. But whether it took place in the cotton fields in southern United States or on the sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean, the African woman experience of enslavement has been one of resistance against all forms of oppression and one of bodily reclamation and self-reconstruction. So tonight's conference at the University of Costa Rica is in fact an opportunity for me to discuss, on the one hand, the historical traumas of the female body of African descent, as well as the persisting negative stereotypes and misrepresentations on Black women in the Americas. And on the other hand, I wish to illustrate what I call the trauma aesthetics. That is to say, how Black women writers and artists transcend historical trauma through creative art and aesthetic embodiment. First, let me discuss the Black female body and the historical traumas, the persisting stereotypes. It is important to note that in traditional African cosmology, the human body is perceived as a capsule, an integral whole, incorporating blood, water, fire, air, soil, and all other symbols of life. Contrastingly, in the Eurocentric, Christian-based and Puritan-influenced systems of thought, the body is mostly perceived on physical terms, as it is seen as a purely biological object. According to Western philosophy, the body is a fixed entity and a submissive object to the power of the mind. In fact, as they felt restricted by this body-mind dichotomy and the imperfect bodily identity that patriarchal discourses granted them, a number of European feminist theorists have contrived to resist the fixedness of this representation between body and mind, the fixedness of this body, and to represent it as a lived body, a bodily identity that resists the fixedness of any conceptual frameworks. And this is their attempt to rethink the female body. It is clear that indeed that the female body cannot be universalized. It cannot be thought as such. In fact, theories by feminists Gayatri Spivak or Lucy Irigaray are extremely relevant as they consider the raced, gendered, and classed bodies through the notion of the lived bodies. As Spivak puts it, if one thinks of the body as such, there is no possible outline of the body as such. There are thinkings of the systematicity of the body. There are value codings of the body, but the body as such cannot be thought. Historically, the bodies of enslaved African women have been the most cruelly exploited and traumatized, and has significantly pointed out in the introduction of Recovering the Black Female Body that you see on screen. In slavery, the Black female body served as one of the prime technologies of reproduction and commodification. Recalling Freud's description of female sexuality as dark continent, the Black woman's body is an incorporeal subject where place, race, and gender interlock. It is a body which suffers from placelessness, as Luce Irigaray names it. In fact, the Black woman is assigned and has been historically assigned a place without occupying a place. To represent her bodily identity, the woman of African descent must now define the space that she occupies, as it is a repositioning into space that will allow her to develop what Elizabeth Gross calls a coherent identity and an ability to manipulate things, including her own body parts in space. Black women must also defy and subvert the multiple misrepresentations and stereotypes about their bodies that have been perpetrated throughout history. A number of mythical Eurocentric constructions of Black womanhood appeared from slavery onward, and thereafter contributed to feeding an ethnocentric master discourse in North American and European societies. In fact, in the 18th and 19th centuries, descriptions of African women often emphasized certain parts of their bodies, especially their posteriors and their breast. We must mention the well-known case of Sgt. Batman, the authentic Venus or Black Venus, whose anatomy was the subject of humiliating live exhibitions in London in the 1810s and in Paris thereafter. We must also remember English soldier Richard Ligon and his description of the enslaved African women as having breasts so long that it seemed from a distance as if they had 6 legs. The plantation was in fact a dual space for the African women as they labored the fields while breastfeeding their children, being mothers and workers at the same time. A number of portraits of Black women by British caricaturists and engravers such as William Hogarth and James Gilray, you can see an example here, have featured representations of women with masculine features and swollen or very long breasts. Here, this is a satirical portrayal of James Gilray in the early 19th century. So while it is clear that slavery is at the very root of the dehumanization and bestialization of African women, these pejorative images form the very basis of the representation of Black women in North American societies. In the European imagination, the image of the Black woman has indeed been constructed from an ambivalent representation where physical resistance and sexual pleasure make her an object of patriarchal lust, a lust coming from white men as much as from Black men, as Caribbean studies specialist Joanna Nemadu explains in her book, Touching the Body. You can see the quotation on screen. Moreover, Black women's sexuality was historically controlled by the European colonizers for obvious economic reasons. As mothers, they were added value to the labor force and increased the owner's property overall, as a number of historians have demonstrated. Deborah White, Angela Davis, Margaret Burnham, all demonstrate in their respective explorations of Black women's history during slavery. Enslaved women were not only encouraged to give birth, they were often the ones who nurtured and breastfed many white babies, as it is recounted in a number of female slave narratives. For example, Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl, or Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize novel, Beloved, where the main protagonist, Seth, an enslaved African woman, is deprived of her maternal milk in the same way as a cow would be milked, an image reflecting the cruel dehumanization of African women during slavery and the exploitation of their bodies. While it is often acknowledged that women were less inclined to rebellion than men, according to historian Betty Wood, popular, and I quote Betty Wood here, popular stereotypes of slave women have portrayed them as passive and downtrodden workforces who did little to advance the struggle for freedom. However, domestic enslaved women would demonstrate resistance through attempts to poison their master's food, consequently facing the death sentence or deportation, end of quote. It is also argued that some women would resist through the refusal to give birth by committing repeated abortions or even infanticides. In that way, they asserted their wish to resist the plantation's absolute need for reproduction, hence endangering, putting into danger its viability, the viability of the plantation system. And in that way, they also refused to give birth to children with a life of servitude as their only prospects. Now, in contemporary societies, negative images, misrepresentations, and stereotypes on the Black female body continue to persist through time and history. Black feminist theorist Patricia Hill Collins, in fact, identifies 4 main representations of the Black woman in the Americas, and I wish now to take you through these 4 main stereotypes: the mammy, the matriarch, the welfare queen, and the Jezebel. Starting with the first representation, the representation of the Black woman as the servile and docile mammy is certainly the most widespread. In fact, the mammy is historically, the mammy or Black nanny is actually a Black servant who takes care of children in white families in the southern United States. The mammy is usually depicted as the good mother. She symbolizes the perfect Black female subordinate, devoted to domestic maintenance work and the well-being of the white family who employs her. She is usually pictured as a good mother to the white children that she brings up. And in fact, she is very much remaining in the domestic space assigned to her. Black feminist theorists see the mammification of the Black woman in the post-World War II years as directly linked to the subordination of Black women in low-paid jobs, especially in domestic areas, thus their continuous exploitation. But mammies and domestics were arguably far from being as subservient and passive as they were depicted. In fact, Black feminist Barbara Christian subverts the myth of the armless domestic mammy in her analysis of slave narratives and describes a mammy who is, I quote, cunning, prone to poisoning her master and not at all content with her lot. In fact, Barbadian historian Hilary Beckles extends the myth of the mammy to the Caribbean context and argues that this myth has contributed to defeminizing Black women. And in fact, Black women are seen as ideologically constructed as essentially non-feminine, as Beckles explains in his book, Centering Woman. This defeminization is surely linked to the second phase of the mammification process. In fact, the mammy figure leads to the matriarch, which is the second stereotype denounced by Black feminists. In fact, the matriarch stereotype turned the Black woman into a bad mother, working excessively long hours and thus neglecting her children. In 1965 in the US, there was the famous Moynihan report entitled The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. This report came to provide evidence to incriminate Black mothers, turning them into matriarchs, into bad mothers, and making them responsible for American Black children's antisocial behaviors and for the growing number of incarcerated Black men. In fact, in the Moynihan report, the Black mother is described as a dominating woman who emasculates her man. And in popular American culture, the Black woman was usually portrayed as fat, dark-skinned, and ugly. The two other well-known representations of the Black woman, which developed later in North America, more specifically in the US, are the myth of the welfare queen and the Jezebel. The representation of the Black woman, first as a welfare mother or welfare queen, first appeared in the US in 1974. And it gained momentum in the 1980s when Black families eventually gained the rights to social welfare benefits and unemployment compensation. In fact, the Black woman was once again stereotyped as responsible for the ills of her community, as she was portrayed, and I quote Patricia Collins here, she was portrayed as content to sit around and collect welfare, shunning work, and passing on her bad values to her offspring. So the welfare queen or welfare mother is basically an extension. So the welfare queen was then an extension of the stereotype of the welfare mother. As even more, she was even more depicted as more materialistic and interested in her own financial profit. Ultimately, the image of the welfare mother, the welfare queen, was linked to the objectification of the enslaved African woman as breeder, since American politicians were concerned with the fertility of the Black women who were viewed as threats and as taking advantage of the welfare state. This stereotype of the welfare queen is still very much present in some Caribbean societies. We do have the equivalent in Martinique, which shows that the stereotype crosses, some stereotypes tend to cross the Americas and to be duplicated. The last stereotype that I want to underline is the image, another image of this mythology that degraded the Black woman is the Jezebel. And the Jezebel is certainly the most well-known contemporary representation of the Black woman as the hypersexualized figure. In fact, the Jezebel is the African-American figure of nudity and hypersexualization. The term has biblical origins, since Jezebel was the wife of Israel's King Ashab, the one who led the servants of Christ astray to indulge in sexual immorality. During slavery, the myth of the Jezebel as the seductress was used to excuse masters who abused their slaves. The Jezebel stereotype still persists today through the hypersexualization of the Black woman in the media. So a number of feminist theorists have conducted research on Black families. They have strongly insisted on the invalidity of the matriarchy thesis. Others have strongly criticized the consequences of such mythical constructions on contemporary Black women and such stereotypes on Black women's bodies. I want to mention Bell Hooks, Elizabeth Shaw, among many others. However, these stereotypes, among additional derived ones, such as the stereotype of the angry Black woman, which was applied to Michelle Obama when she was the first lady, and this stereotype of the angry Black woman remains and continues to feed a historical continuum of oppressions against women of African descent. So whether African, African-American, or African Caribbean, the Black woman is constantly affected by these myths that have been perpetrated through imperial and patriarchal systems of domination. I'm going to move now swiftly to the second part of my talk. I just want to check with the interpreter that I am not talking too fast. I can't hear, so I think she responded. All right. So moving on to the second part of my conference, I want now, after taking you through the history of trauma, the fact that some stereotypes are being perpetrated through time and history, I will now proceed to examine a sample of literary and artistic representations that may unsettle or deconstruct, come to deconstruct these misrepresentations, come to deconstruct these controlling myths and binaries which have been established in North American societies and continue to be perpetrated across the Americas. Within a comparative perspective, in fact, my research work seeks to highlight the complexity and plurality of modes of representation of the Black female body and the intermingling of socio-cultural, racial, and gendered borders. As I will focus on text and sculptures, so I choose to focus on text and sculptures, it is truly, for me, a strategy to measure how the aesthetic representations of these Black bodily spaces become genuine instruments of a renewal of feminine subjectivities beyond trauma. While some women authors may choose to develop rather unconventional approaches to the Black female body, others may long to express its right to exist as such, against Eurocentric norms of beauty, as well as against recurrent gender construction patterns across the Americas. Indeed, what I really find interesting to look at is the extent to which women artists and writers manage to make the Black female body visible, audible, and tangible, hence reconstructing and remembering it beyond historical trauma. And above all, how do these women artists assert the Black female body as a political space, as a space of resistance, of reclamation, and of self-empowerment? So I wish to illustrate my talk by taking a few examples. First, the work of Trinidadian Canadian writer Norbisi Philip and her specific strategies to impose the rewriting of the Black female body. In fact, Philip has a strategy which focusing on the reclamation of the tongue. She depicts the tongue as the most important part of the body, which would allow to reacquire power. Essentially, this tongue would allow the Black female to recreate one's own image, a fundamental process to achieve self-assertion. In fact, the notion of image is very central to the construction of Black female identities. This notion entails a genuine process of self-definition and self-reconstruction through the discursive self. As voice and trauma are embodied, the Black female body is a body memory, one that expresses the interconnection between time, self, and voice. And this is a dialectic that will eventually allow self-recovery. And in fact, art and literature are tools to move towards this self-recovery and this self-healing, as well as self-empowerment. So Philip's text, now Norbisi Philip's text, she tries her tongue, her silence softly breaks, as well as a genealogy of resistance. I have chosen two of her texts which offer comparable prospects of bodily remembering and processes of healing and renewal. In fact, in prose and in poetry, Philip denounces the dislocation of African Caribbean female bodies, and she depicts bodies in search of discursive recreation, provided that the Black African women's tongues would be remembered. As you see in the excerpt here, this excerpt really denounces the Black female's objectification in the process of enslavement, which took the product of her body and the body's wisdoms. And here, as you see, body and place appear as intrinsically linked through the predominance of the semantic field of cultivation, culture. The Black female body is here dehumanized and metaphorized as land, as it is plowed, fertilized, and harvested for reproduction. Here it echoes Ben Heller's statement that Caribbean landscapes are often metaphorized as feminine his article, the article Landscape, Femininity, and Caribbean Discourse. So in Philip's genealogy, through the ellipsis of the auxiliary verbs, as you see here, which is typical of the Caribbean Creole demotic, criminal processes are condemned in a more straightforward manner, and enslavers are openly accused of depriving African women of their bodies and of their very being. Far from performing victimhood, the following verses in Philip's poetry brutally highlight some of the rebellious responses from African women to the dispossession of their bodies. And you see this excerpt here. Some African women nursing, infanticide, reproducing, aborting, a warping and twisting of the filaments of silence between African and body, body and text, body becoming text, which she learning to read in a new language and becoming to understand how to survive text, becoming body, bodies, dead bodies, murdered bodies, imported, bred, mutilated bodies, sold. So here, recalling the horrible facts, Philip engages the reader into an exploration of the Black female body as profoundly mutilated and fractured, but also as intrinsically associated with the text. Because when you look at the earlier verses, from body and place, we are moving to body and text, body becoming text. Thus, the survival of the body resides in its very capacity to become tongue in order to voice its trauma and to recreate itself discursively. As you see, the absence of punctuation and the opacity of the last section convey a suffocating feeling that may force the reader to imagine this dismembered body, scarred by rejected maternities, and still striving for survival. So while the African Caribbean female has long been depicted as a silent victim, Nobisi Philip here chooses to underline her silence as a tool for resistance and reparation through acts of rebellion as abortions and infanticides, which were, as I said earlier, forms of bodily resistance against patriarchal oppressions. So resistance and self-reliance, therefore, allow the Black female subject to assert her self-power and to construct a new language, which is translated in the final series of lines with the connected words. So despite the distortion and murder of physical material bodies, new discursive and political bodies are created as the textual bodies transcend trauma and assert their unalterable presence on the page. In the same way, I will discuss African-American artist Simone Leigh and a representation of the Black female body, which is quite disturbing because it enhances a similar focus on resilient bodies, bodies that resist and survive historical damage and commodification. Simone Leigh's artistic practice is based on the body as object. And in fact, if you look at her sculptures here, she enhances female agency beyond oppression and beyond labor. Leigh constantly fuses bodies and objects, bodies and space. And if you look at this ceramic sculpture here, she depicts the face jogs that were fabricated by the enslaved African-American potters in South Carolina. And here she relates this to the image of the subservient mammy figure. So she chooses to link the bodies and the objects. She enhances their functions but at the same time, she explores new tropes of beauty. With her most recent work, Brick Lane, she imposes, and you can see a photograph here, she imposes the magnificence of the Black female body in the heart of New York, among skyscrapers and traffic. In fact, Lay's cultural art allows the human body to fuse with architecture. And in a way, the body, the Black female body here, is reclaiming its presence and its visibility in a space where it was often rejected from. I see the plaits of the hair here as somewhat reminiscent of the Venus of Willendorf, this mother goddess symbol, a fertility figure. The Venus of Willendorf, or the nude woman, was this upper Paleolithic figuring found in 1908 at Willendorf, Austria. If you look at her head, is present, you can see that the head is present, but the main details reside in the patterns representing the braids or a cap. And in fact, her feet are missing and were probably never a part of the whole design. I have chosen to include another sculptor from Costa Rica today, even if I have not yet met her, and I wish I will have an opportunity to interview her. And in fact, you have seen her work as she has kindly offered the visual of the poster advertising the event tonight. In fact, Costa Rican artist and sculptor Leda Astorga, who she depicts these fat Black female bodies that are self-assertive, rebellious, self-empowered. The nakedness and the dreadlocks on the first sculpture, the semi-nakedness and the hair left untied and floating in the wind on the second, all of this appear to resonate with freedom and rejection of normative boundaries, as well as patriarchal oppression. Of course, there is so much more to say about these cultures, and I promise to do a conference next time I come to Costa Rica with more element development after I met the author, the artist. But I do intend to investigate the link between these different artists across the Americas. In fact, it's interesting to note that the representation of the Black female body with these voluptuous shapes and the association of fatness and Blackness can be seen across the Caribbean. And when I say the Caribbean, I talk about the wider Caribbean. And a number of women artists tend to depict the fat Black woman as a personification of survival against all odds and beyond historical trauma. In fact, across the global Caribbean, we can find resilient cultures of fat Black women who exist beyond space and time. In Barbados, you have Mother Sally that you see here, who is the Afro-Caribbean cultural expression of fertility. She's always represented with her voluptuous shapes and exaggerated bosom, which is celebrated and which in a way turned into derision the historical degradation of the Black female body. In Curacao, the Dutch Caribbean, I came across some of the famous colorful chichis who are also embodiments of fatness and abundance. In Papiamento, chichi refers to older women that young people hold on high esteem for advice and guidance, a sort of focus on ancestry. Still in Curacao, this is a sculpture by female artist Hortense Brown, And you see the reference to fatness again. And I have come across these representations of the fat Black female body across the Black Americas and even in Canada. These women's body exist and occupy space with their fatness, which symbolizes presence and power. All of these representations that I have just shown you of the Black female bodies exist and occupy the space with, they tend to depict those bodies occupying the space with their fatness, symbolizing, as I said, power, defiance against time and space. My very last example tonight is the example of I will go back to the text now and to discuss the poetry by Guyanese British writer Grace Nichols. And in fact, she has a volume called The Fat Black Woman's Poems. In her poem entitled Thoughts Drifting Through the Fat Black Woman's Head While Having a Full Bubble Bath, the fat Black woman is depicted here through her activist ideals as she defies the master codes and impose the power of her body parts while soaking in a bubble bath. In fact, there is a mixture here of femininity and resistance. I love this excerpt here. In fact, how I long to place my foot on the head of anthropology, to swing my breast in the face of history, to scrub my back with the dogma of theology. As you see in this excerpt, the Black female body seeks reconstruction through rebellion against canonical discourses and against master theoretical fields, whether it is anthropology, history, religion, medicine, aesthetics, and linguistics. Hence, she's challenging this master discursive body, which degraded and fragmented the Black female flesh and psyche throughout history. The re-empowered figure of the fat Black woman here performs within the spaces, she can perform within the spaces that were previously denied to her. This is what Grace Nichols' poetry exemplifies, this Black woman's urge for spatial repossession and bodily self-reclamation. So while fatness goes against Eurocentric norms of beauty, so in fact, in Europe, fatness is not part of the Eurocentric norm in terms of beauty and canonical beauty. But in the Caribbean, fatness is often culturally associated with well-being and generosity. In some mythical representations, in fact, women's breasts and fleshy bottoms are associated to resilience. For example, Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica, who is said to have used her fleshy buttocks to rebel against enslavers. The symbolism of the breast is also linked to resistance through mythical references to the one-breasted rebellious women, this clan of legendary Amazons. So the fat Black woman is therefore a warrior female figure who swings her breast at misrepresentations and rejects the historical continuum of oppressions against women of African descent. At the end of Grace Nichols' poem, the discursive construct of the assertion, "But this fat Black woman ain't no Jemima, sure thing, honey, yeah," appears to echo Sojourner Truth's rhetorical question, "Entire woman." In fact, this last verse actually reminds the reader that this is a performed poetry. This is a poetry of performance, a poetry where the fat Black woman's voice can be heard beyond the physicality of the body. In fact, the speech, therefore, blurs with the body, which is quite close to what Philip was doing in her poetry as well, mixing the body and the text. And this is therefore replicating Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity. So in Nichols' poetry, fatness is positively associated with freedom, with freedom of speech, belief, feeling, and choice, hence allowing bodies to exist as such without being restricted by Western norms of beauty. So to finish, I want to show you the poem entitled Afterword, which concludes the collection that Grace Nichols, the Fat Black Women's poems. In fact, this poem shows the fat Black woman as transcending traumatic stereotypes and as eventually reconstructing her own subjectivity. One that embraces fatness, gender, race, and class. And as you see here, behold now the fat Black woman who will come out of the forest when the last of her race is finally and utterly extinguished. The fat Black woman will emerge and tremblingly, fearlessly stake her claim again. So this is truly about self-expression and reclaiming power and voice. To conclude my conference, I want to say that the different strategies used by these women artists and writers to represent the Black female body against its historical misrepresentations and to define new body politics. This is really about defining new body politics. In fact, reconstruction and self-representation can only occur through a political self-repositioning and refusal to censor their bodies, as Ellen Sixu puts it. In fact, as Sixu writes, by writing herself, woman returns to the body which has been more than confiscated from her. So I would say definitely it's about self-representation and making the body heard. And this is what the trauma aesthetics are about. Through the trauma aesthetics, art and literature allow the recovery to be envisioned, allow the self-healing to be thought. The woman artist can engage in a genuine process of reappropriation of her body and tongue. In fact, the text of Nobesi Philip, Grace Nichols, as well as the sculptures of Simon Lay, Leda Astorga, function as writing, talking, sculpting, and even performing cures, which allow self-healing and self-assertion through the creation of new body politics and images that can be heard and seen across borders and beyond historical trauma. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Myriam Moïse, que nos acompañó con nos ha ofrecido esta magnífica conferencia. A continuación, tenemos un espacio abierto para las preguntas, las cuales pueden ser planteadas tanto a través de la sección de comentarios en la página Facebook, donde estamos transmitiendo esta conferencia, como en el chat aquí en quienes estamos reunidos a través de Zoom. Aquí en el chat encuentro un comentario que puedo ir compartiendo con Myriam mientras más personas participan con algún comentario o pregunta. Y era, en algún momento Myriam hace referencia a la mami. María Lourdes Cortés nos comenta que es el personaje de la criada de la película Lo que el viento se llevó, Gone with the Wind, y que fue la primera actriz afroamericana que obtuvo un Oscar. Señala además de que, claro, era justamente la sirvienta de la chica blanca. Esa era la representación de este personaje en esta conocida película. Y por ahora es el único comentario que tenemos aquí en la transmisión por Zoom. Myriam, este personaje, el de la mami de Gone with the Wind, cabría dentro de este tipo de, de representaciones que estás trabajando. Está en silencio. Sí.
Yeah, I could not, I don't have the translation.
It's about the black character
Mhm.
of it's about the character of the black servant in the film Gone with the Wind.
Gone with the Wind.
Okay.
Mami in
Mami.
Gone with the Wind.
Okay, all
She
right.
won an Oscar.
Yeah.
The first,
Okay.
woman Afro-woman.
Yeah, so is it a comment or a question?
It's a comment.
Oh, okay, it's a comment. Yes, indeed, indeed. You can link the character of the Mami to so many elements in popular culture. Of course, you have the representation of Aunt Jemima on the pancakes advertising box, which was only recently being questioned. So in fact, the Mami, you have different types of Mami representation, but in fact, in cinema, you even have a movie about these maids. I think I know that the title in French, but not in English. In French is La couleur des sentiments, but it was about the exactly how devious the maids could actually be to find strategies to still be rebellious, even if they looked very obedient, in fact. The help, yes, thank you very much, the help.
Otro comentario que, bueno, un comentario no más bien, algo que permitió recordar la conferencia de Myriam Moïse era justamente la presencia dentro del arte costarricense de Leda Astorga, ¿verdad? Que se me escapó en la presentación de inicio justamente agradecerle al artista que nos facilitó una de las obras plásticas que justamente ahorita Myriam Moïse acaba de mencionar en su conferencia, Rayito de Luna. Un agradecimiento a Leda por esto para utilizarlo en el afiche de la conferencia. Tengo aquí un segundo comentario que es justamente la referencia de Help, la película y también el libro, ¿verdad? Que se conecta con lo que está mencionando la doctora Moïse.
Yeah, this is the title of what I've mentioned. I don't know if people are actually hearing any translation, but I'm not, just to say. But
Myriam,
it's okay, I understand the Spanish, and if you write your questions, it's even better actually than speaking.
Myriam, you have to habilitate the translation to hear Roxana.
Habilitate.
Yes.
You don't know what.
I clicked on English.
On the globe icon, yes.
Yeah, but it's.
You
yeah,
have
I can
to
hear
put
you,
it
but it's
on
not
English.
changed anything, though. Yeah, but I have not changed anything from earlier, but that's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Mencionaba que gracias a usted recordamos el agradecimiento que hay que extenderle a Leda Astorga, que nos facilitó para el póster de la actividad justamente una imagen de su escultura Rayito de Luna, que usted posteriormente mencionó en esta conferencia.
Indeed, in the I don't know if it was a question, but in the context of this this program, Connect Caribbean, as you see, the name is about connecting the Caribbean. So this is my first time in Costa Rica, and I have identified, thanks to my colleagues Karen and Werner, this sculpture, this woman's sculpture, and in fact, I would like to include her in my research. So I have just started investigating about this, and I will try and meet her before I leave Costa Rica next month.
Myriam, tengo una pregunta de Roxana Hidalgo, la directora del doctorado en Sociedad y Cultura. Are you hearing in English? Okay. It's a little bit long. ¿Podrías preguntarle si podría profundizar sobre cómo ve ella esta posibilidad de utilizar el concepto de escritura femenina de CIHAC en la construcción de estrategias de resistencia en el caso de las mujeres negras que desean enfrentar los traumas de la violencia vivida producto de los procesos de racialización?
Okay, I think I understood the question overall. I believe that the trauma aesthetics can be applied to Black women who have experienced intersectional oppressions. So I work in the framework of Black feminist theory. So that means that intersectionality is really at the heart of my work, and I use it to define the complexity of the women of African descent, but more generally non-white women, because of course we have to include indigenous women, women of Indian descent. In the Caribbean, it's very much a creolized society. So it is really about not only considering trauma from a historical perspective only, but also from an inherited perspective, because racism is of course, it is part of our research on the race and racialization, especially in the Caribbean, where it is very complexified. Racism is complexified through other processes like colorism. So it is not only about racism, but it's also about color stratification, which comes to complexify the Caribbean society's vision, organization, and the social phenomenon around that would entail racism.
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta, comentario?
Aquí en el Zoom, ¿no?
No, en Facebook tampoco me han pasado a mí.
Facebook no tenemos preguntas, solo comentarios de agradecimiento por la conferencia.
You don't have questions.
Estoy dándole una oportunidad a ver si hay algún nuevo comentario, ¿verdad? Si no, creo que, bueno, aquí escucharíamos a Karen, a Myriam, digamos, para ir cerrando esta actividad, ¿verdad?
Creo que nos has dejado sin palabras, Myriam.
A mí me dejó con muchas ganas de ir a buscar imágenes, a buscar libros, a volver a ver películas. Mencionó la idea de, ¿cómo era? La Venus, ¿verdad? En París,
Otrantot.
¿verdad? La mujer afrodescendiente. Hay una película sobre el tema, se llama creo que La Venus Negra.
Ujú.
Yo no la he visto, pero es de este
Yeah.
director Abdelatif Kechiche. Es así, sí conozco la referencia, ya me siento invitado a ir a buscarla, la tengo pendiente desde hace rato justamente. Em, Creo que entonces aquí quedaríamos con esta actividad. Por dicha, Myriam, como mencionó recientemente, va a estar por acá en Costa Rica todavía un par de semanas al menos. Ojalá tenga la oportunidad más de encontrarse con Leda Astorga, que también está muy interesada en conocerla. Y muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta actividad. Muchas gracias al Posgrado en Arte, muchas gracias al programa, el proyecto Encuentro Internacional, o sea, para no se escape el nombre completo, sobre patologías del capitalismo. Muchas gracias a la Escuela de Psicología y por supuesto al proyecto ConnectCaribbean que organizó esta actividad. Muy buenas noches.
Thank you.